For 6 months, they walked past her every single day. Not one person knew her real name, or what she had done before this. She pushed a maintenance cart through restricted corridors, emptied trash bins outside the operations center, and cleaned floors while officers planned missions around her like she was furniture. When a SEAL team went dark and 52 enemy fighters began closing in with lethal precision, command had minutes to decide and no good options left. That is when the woman everyone dismissed as background staff asked a single question that made the entire room go silent. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you appreciate stories about people who prove that being underestimated can be the most dangerous advantage of all, consider subscribing. What happened next forced everyone in that operations center to see her completely differently. The fluorescent lights in the corridor of forward operating base. Sentinel hummed with the kind of low frequency that most people stopped hearing after the first week. It was 02:47 hours, deep into the night shift, when the base felt like it was holding its breath between one crisis and the next. The polished floors reflected those lights in long, sterile strips, and the only sound breaking the silence was the rhythmic squeak of a maintenance cartwheel that needed oil. Dolores Embick pushed that cart with the same methodical pace she had maintained for 6 months. Her coveralls were faded gray, worn soft at the elbows and knees, and her name tag was slightly crooked, though no one had ever been close enough to notice. She was the kind of person time had made anonymous, maybe 40, maybe 50. The kind of face that existed in the background of 100 different photographs without anyone remembering it was there. She moved through the checkpoint without slowing. The 2 guards stationed there were focused on their screens, tracking vehicle movements outside the perimeter. One of them shifted his rifle strap without looking up. The other yawned. Neither registered her presence as anything more than a shadow passing through their peripheral vision. This was normal. This was exactly how she needed it to be. Dolores stopped outside the operations center and set down her spray bottle. The door was partially open, enough to let the sound of radio chatter bleed into the hallway. Routine patrol check-ins, weather updates from observation posts along the eastern ridge, the low murmur of voices discussing supply requisition schedules. She sprayed the water fountain mounted on the wall and began wiping it down in small circular motions, the same pattern she used every night. While her hands worked, her eyes tracked 3 separate things: the wall clock above the doorway showing 02:51, the patrol rotation board visible through a window across the hall where magnetic tags indicated which teams were active and which were standing down, and a set of boot prints on the floor. Near the stairwell, deep treads that did not match standard issue patterns. She processed all of this in the time it took to wipe down the fountain twice, then dismissed it with the faintest shake of her head. Not her concern. Not anymore. A young lieutenant emerged from the operations center moving fast, phone pressed against his ear, and nearly collided with her cart. He sidestepped at the last second without breaking stride or acknowledging her existence. His coffee cup remained balanced in his other hand, steam rising in a thin line. Dolores shifted her cart 3 inches to the left to clear his path, a movement so automatic it barely registered as conscious thought. She continued down the corridor toward the communications hub. The base felt different tonight, though she doubted anyone else had noticed. The difference was in the small things. Officers moving between buildings with slightly more urgency. Radio traffic up by maybe 15%. The kind of shift that happened before something broke into the open. She had learned to read these patterns the way some people read weather, and tonight the pressure was dropping. Captain Nesmith appeared from around the corner, tablet in hand, eyes fixed on whatever report he was scrolling through. He walked directly toward her without adjusting his path. Dolores stopped, moved her cart against the wall, and waited. He passed within 6 inches without glancing up, close enough that his shoulder brushed the handle of her mop. When he was 3 steps past, he called back over his shoulder. "Can you do this during day shift? We have got actual work happening here." Dolores kept her voice flat and even. "Third shift is when these floors get cleaned, sir. Protocol." He was already turning the corner before she finished speaking. The sound of his footsteps faded toward the administrative wing. She stood still for exactly 5 seconds, then resumed her work as though the interaction had never happened. Her face showed nothing. Her hands maintained the same steady rhythm, but something very old and very quiet shifted behind her eyes before disappearing back into careful emptiness. The hallway outside the communications hub was her next stop. She positioned her cart near the doorway and began cleaning the baseboards, a task that required her to work slowly and stay low. Through the partially open door, she could hear fragments of conversation layered over each other. Someone was talking about satellite coverage windows. Someone else was requesting updated imagery for a sector designated Echo 7. A third voice mentioned equipment failure, but the tone suggested the speaker did not believe that explanation. Dolores worked the same 3-foot section of baseboard for nearly 4 minutes. Her cloth moved in small, precise circles. Her breathing remained steady, and she absorbed every word coming through that door, with the kind of focus most people reserved for life-threatening situations. Paladin, actual is 3 hours overdue for check-in. The voice belonged to Major Qualls. Dolores recognized it from the 100 other times she had cleaned floors while he ran briefings. His tone was controlled but tight, the kind of tight that came from trying to manage a situation that was slipping out of acceptable parameters. Last known position was Grid Echo 7, right? Another voice, younger. Lieutenant Sark, probably. Affirmative. They were running reconnaissance near the Haraza Valley approach. Could be equipment failure, radio malfunction, or they are compromised. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds. Dolores counted them. When the conversation resumed, it had shifted into lower registers, the kind of volume people used when they did not want to be overheard. She stayed exactly where she was, cleaning the same spot, invisible. Lieutenant Faraj emerged from the communications hub, moving fast, phone already at his ear before he cleared the doorway. We need ISR assets. Over that sector now. I do not care what else is scheduled. Bump it. His left hand was trembling slightly. The coffee cup he carried in his other hand had gone cold, steam no longer rising. He did not notice Dolores crouched against the wall 2 feet from his path. She watched him disappear around the corner, then returned her attention to the door. Major Qualls was speaking again, his words clipped and deliberate. 8 operators. Paladin Actual is Lieutenant Commander Grayson's team. SEALs? Affirmative. Dolores stopped moving. For exactly 2 seconds, her hands went completely still against the baseboard. Then she resumed the circular wiping motion as though nothing had changed. But something had changed. The careful blankness she wore like armor had developed a hairline crack, visible only if someone had been watching closely. No one was watching. She finished the baseboard and stood, joints protesting quietly. As she emptied a nearby trash can, her hand moved with practiced efficiency, sorting through discarded papers without appearing to look at them. Most of it was routine waste, protein bar wrappers, crumpled printouts of weather reports, but near the bottom, folded twice and stained with coffee, was an intelligence brief someone had thrown away without shredding. Dolores palmed it in a motion so smooth it could have been accidental. She continued her rounds, cart squeaking its familiar rhythm until she reached a supply closet 3 corridors away. She slipped inside, locked the door, and turned on the dim overhead light. The brief was a terrain map. Grid lines overlaid topographical features. Haraza Valley approach routes marked in red. Someone had annotated it with estimated travel times and alternate exfiltration points. Dolores spread it flat on a shelf and studied it with an intensity that would have startled anyone who had seen her cleaning floors. Her finger traced a specific ridgeline, moved southeast, and stopped at a geographical feature, marked only as dry, wadi, seasonal. Her lips moved, forming a single word without sound. Gulam. She stood there for a long time, staring at that map. Then she folded it carefully, carried it to the utility sink in the corner, and held a lighter beneath it until the paper caught. She watched it burn down to ash, then washed the remnants down the drain with water that ran cold against her hands. When she returned to the corridor, her face had reset to its default expression of careful neutrality. But the crack in her armor had widened, just slightly, and something underneath was beginning to show through. The operations center had become the gravitational center of the base. Dolores could feel it from 3 hallways away. The increase in foot traffic, the change in radio chatter from routine to urgent, the way officers moved with the kind of purpose that came from knowing something bad was unfolding and having limited options to address it. She positioned herself in the corridor, outside, close enough to hear, but far enough to remain unnoticed. Her mop moved across the same section of floor in long, overlapping strokes. She had cleaned this area twice already tonight, but no one was tracking her movements closely enough to notice the repetition. Through the partially open door, she could see the main tactical display. It showed a satellite view of terrain she recognized immediately, marked with colored symbols indicating friendly and hostile positions. The hostile markers were multiplying. Drone feed confirms hostile movement. Multiple vehicles converging on Echo 7. Someone was reading from a screen, voice tight with the effort of staying professional. Approximately 52 heat signatures. They are setting up a perimeter. Disciplined movement. This is not opportunistic. Another voice, sharper. They knew Paladin would be there. How was that possible? Leak? Intercept? Does not matter right now. What matters is, those 8 men have maybe 2 hours before. That net closes completely. Dolores felt something shift in her chest. A sensation she had not allowed herself to feel in 8 years. It started as a tightness and spread outward, pulling at old instincts she had buried under layers of deliberate forgetting. Her hands kept moving across the floor, but her breathing had changed, becoming slower and more controlled. Captain Nesmith appeared in the doorway, nearly stepping on her mop. He pulled back with visible irritation. Can someone get maintenance out of this corridor? This is sensitive traffic. An MP materialized from somewhere down the hall, young and apologetic. Ma'am, you need to restrict your cleaning to non-operational areas until further notice. Dolores nodded without speaking. She gathered her cart and moved away, boots squeaking softly on the floor she had just cleaned. But instead of returning to the maintenance depot, she turned down a different corridor, one that most people did not know connected to the ventilation system, one that had access panels positioned near the operations center. She found the panel she needed, removed it with a multi-tool she kept in her pocket, and crouched in the narrow space behind the wall. Through a maintenance grate, she had a direct line of sight into the operations center, and more importantly, she could hear everything. The room was packed now, 12 officers at least, clustered around the tactical display. Major Qualls stood at the center, arms crossed, jaw tight. The screen showed the enemy positions as red diamonds forming a tightening circle around a small cluster of green markers. Extract team is 30 minutes out minimum, and that is if we launch now. 30 minutes puts them in contact with hostiles during exfiltration. What about air support? We would need clearance. This is technically across the border, political nightmare in the making. So, what are you saying? We abandon them? The silence that followed was worse than any answer. Dolores watched, through the grate as officers exchanged looks. She saw the moment when they began accepting the unacceptable, making the calculations that turned 8 lives into acceptable losses weighed against political complications. Her hands tightened against the metal grate, not hard enough to make noise, just hard enough that her knuckles went white. They are blocking every Western approach. That is Paladin's most likely escape vector. Lieutenant Sark was tracing routes on the display with his finger. Eastern routes put them into open ground. They would be exposed for 3 kilometers. Suicide. Northern route? Cliffs, unclimbable with their gear load. So, what is the play? I do not see one. We are out of plays. Dolores closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw different terrain, the same valley, but from ground level, the weight of zip ties cutting into her wrists, the smell of diesel fuel and gunpowder, voices speaking Pashto in the next room, casual and unhurried. 14 months compressed into a single point of memory, so sharp it could still cut. When she opened her eyes, her breathing had changed again. Deeper, steadier. The breathing pattern of someone preparing to do something that could not be undone. Through the grate, she studied the tactical display more carefully. The terrain features were exactly where she remembered them. The wadi cutting northeast from Grid Echo 7, the ridgeline that overlooked it, the seasonal stream bed that only locals knew about because it was dry 11 months out of the year. She could see the trap as clearly as if she had designed it herself, because in a way, she had. Not this specific operation, but others like it. She knew the thinking behind those red diamonds, knew the commander who was almost certainly running this operation, knew his patterns, his preferences, his tactical signature. Ghulam Mazdek had been methodical during her captivity, patient. He had studied her the way an entomologist studies an insect, documenting responses and cataloging weaknesses. And she had studied him right back, memorizing everything because survival required knowing your enemy better than they knew themselves. The officers in the operations center were still arguing, voices rising, options being raised and dismissed, time bleeding away while 8 men waited for rescue that was not coming. Dolores shifted in the cramped space behind the wall. Her coveralls were dusty now. Her knees ached from crouching. She could leave, walk away, return to her cart and finish her shift and let someone else make the impossible decisions. She had earned that distance, paid for it with pieces of herself she would never get back. But she could also hear Captain Nesmith saying, "Those 8 men have maybe 2 hours." Could see the resignation forming in Major Qualls's expression. Could calculate exactly how this would end if no one intervened. She stayed behind that grate for another 3 minutes, listening to the sound of good people running out of options. Then she replaced the panel, returned to the corridor, and stood perfectly still. Her hand reached toward the operations center door, then dropped. Reached again. Dropped again. The third time, it stayed raised. For 8 years, Dolores Embick had maintained one unbreakable rule: stay invisible, speak only when necessary, never draw attention, never let anyone see past the surface. It was the only way to survive what she had survived, the only way to build something that resembled a life from the wreckage of the person she used to be. She stood in that corridor with her hand on the door, and she broke her rule. The door swung open. She stepped inside, and for exactly 10 seconds, no one noticed. Then Lieutenant Farage looked up from his tablet. "Ma'am, you cannot be in here." Captain Nesmith turned, recognition and irritation crossing his face simultaneously. "I told you, maintenance is restricted from operational areas." Dolores looked past both of them, to the tactical display showing the trap tightening around 8 men who were running out of time. When she spoke, her voice was different, quieter than before, but with a weight underneath that had not been there during any of their previous interactions. The Wadi. Everyone stopped. The room went silent in the way a room goes silent when something has just broken the established order of things. Major Qualls was the first to respond. "Excuse me?" Dolores kept her eyes on the display. "You are assuming they will move west because that is doctrine. But there is a dry wadi cutting northeast from Grid Echo 7, 3.2 kilometers, exits near the Tanzer Ridge outcrop." The silence deepened. Several officers exchanged glances. Captain Nesmith opened his mouth to speak, but Dolores continued before he could. "If Commander Grayson is operational, and if the enemy force commander has worked this terrain before, he is not blocking the wadi because he is using it himself. If you have ever had to choose between staying silent and speaking up when it mattered most, share that story in the comments. And if you believe that sometimes the most important voices are the ones we train ourselves not to hear, subscribe to see how this moment changes everything." Major Qualls took 3 steps forward, close enough that Dolores could see the fatigue lines around his eyes and the coffee stain on his sleeve that he had not noticed yet. His expression had shifted from irritation to something more complex, something that lived in the space between confusion and the dawning recognition that he might be missing critical information. "What did you just say?" Dolores kept her voice level, her hands loose at her sides, in a deliberate display of non-threat. "The enemy is not blocking every route. They are funneling. The wadi is the trap, not the exit." Lieutenant Sark was already moving toward a secondary terminal, fingers flying across the keyboard. He pulled up geological survey data, overlaying it against the tactical map. "There is a wadi system there, barely on our maps. Seasonal drainage, mostly dry this time of year." Captain Nesmith stepped between Dolores and the main display, his posture broadcasting authority and skepticism in equal measure. "This is a maintenance worker making tactical guesses based on, what exactly? A glance at a map?" Dolores met his eyes without flinching. "It is not a guess." The way she said it cut through the room like a blade. Not loud, not aggressive, just absolute. The kind of certainty that came from experience rather than theory. Several officers shifted their attention fully to her now, reassessing what they were seeing. Major Qualls studied her with the expression of someone trying to solve a problem that had suddenly become more complicated than expected. "How do you know this terrain?" Dolores held the silence for exactly 3 seconds before answering. "I know it." That is not an answer. Qualls moved closer still, voice dropping to a register meant only for her. "What is your clearance level?" "I clean floors, Major." "That is not what I asked." The room had gone completely still. Even the radio chatter seemed muted, as though the base itself was holding its breath, waiting for her response. Dolores felt the weight of every eye on her, felt the old instinct to deflect and disappear pressing against her ribs. She pushed back against it, high enough to know that 52 fighters did not converge by accident. Someone is running this operation who knows how SEALs think. And if I am right about who that is, your men are walking into an L-shaped ambush in that wadi in approximately 40 minutes. The specificity of her statement landed like a physical thing. Lieutenant Faraj had his tablet out, fingers hovering over the screen. Captain Nesmith opened his mouth and closed it again without speaking. Major Qualls continued to stare at her with an intensity that would have been uncomfortable if Dolores had not spent 14 months being stared at by people who wanted to break her. "Who are you?" Before Dolores could answer, Qualls turned to his deputy. "Pull her personnel file, now." The deputy, a lieutenant whose name tag read Morrison, moved to a secure terminal and began typing rapidly. The sound of keys clicking filled the silence while everyone waited. Dolores used the time to study the tactical display more carefully, noting the positions of the hostile forces and the predicted movement vectors that the intelligence software had generated. The predictions were wrong, but explaining why would require revealing more than she was ready to reveal. Major Qualls turned back to her, jaw tight. "You have 2 minutes to explain how a maintenance contractor knows tactical doctrine and terrain mapping better than my intelligence staff." Dolores glanced at the clock on the wall. "You do not have 2 minutes, Major. You have one decision. Trust the plan you can see, or trust the wadi you cannot." The challenge hung in the air between them. Behind Qualls, the tactical display updated with new drone imagery. The hostile forces were tightening their formation, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested professional training and centralized command. Lieutenant Sark highlighted the movement patterns, his expression growing darker. They are repositioning. Whatever they are planning, it is happening soon. Lieutenant Morrison straightened from his terminal, tablet in hand. His face had gone pale in a way that suggested he had just found something he was not expecting. He crossed the room in 4 quick steps and handed the tablet to Major Qualls without saying a word. Qualls took it, looked down at the screen, and went completely still. The change in his posture was subtle, but absolute, like a door closing. When he looked up at Dolores again, his entire expression had transformed from skepticism to something that approached shock. Dolores Embick is not your real name. Dolores felt the ground shift beneath her, felt 8 years of careful construction beginning to crack. Her voice stayed steady anyway. "It is now. You were declared KIA 8 years ago." Qualls read from the screen slowly, as though still processing what he was seeing. "Senior Chief Petty Officer, attached to JSOC Operations, 3 tours, Haraza Valley Sector." The room had gone dead silent. Every officer was frozen, caught between their previous assumptions and the information currently rewriting their understanding of reality. Captain Nesmith looked like someone had just told him the floor was actually the ceiling. Qualls stopped reading, looked at Dolores, and finished in a quieter voice. "Prisoner of war for 14 months." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This was the silence of people confronting the fact that they had been catastrophically wrong about something fundamental. Dolores watched them process it, saw the moment when the maintenance worker in their peripheral vision snapped into focus as something else entirely. She chose her next words carefully, keeping her tone factual and empty of self-pity. "I did not come back the same person, could not go back to the teams. They gave me medical retirement, a new identity if I wanted it, and this job. I wanted to disappear, and I did." She gestured toward the tactical display showing the tightening net around 8 men who were running out of options and time. But the man running that operation? I know him, Ghulam Mazdek, because he is the one who held me in that valley for 14 months. Lieutenant Sark sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Jesus Christ. Major Qualls set the tablet down on the table with deliberate care, as though it might explode if handled roughly. "You know his tactics." Dolores nodded once. "I know how he thinks. He is not just a fighter. He is methodical, patient. He studies his enemy." She moved toward the tactical display, officers parting to let her through. "He will have spotters on this ridge, shooters staged in the Wadi Bend here, and a blocking force positioned here. Her finger traced positions on the screen with the confidence of someone who had walked that exact terrain, who had memorized every stone and shadow during months of captivity when memorization meant the difference between escape and death. He is not trying to kill your men fast. He is trying to capture them. Leverage. The word leverage carried weight that went beyond tactical analysis. Everyone in the room understood what it meant, understood what happened to captured operators in that region, understood that Dolores was describing a fate she had lived through and barely survived. Lieutenant Faraj leaned forward, voice tight. If they go into that wadi, they are done. Dolores shook her head. There is a secondary route, a goat trail, barely navigable. Here. She indicated a thin line on the terrain map that showed as empty space between contour lines. Most maps do not show it. Because it is not wide enough for vehicles and locales do not advertise paths they use for smuggling. I used it to escape. Ghulam does not know it exists because his people do not use it. Major Qualls straightened, and Dolores watched his expression shift from shock into the operational mode of someone who had just received actionable intelligence. Can you walk us through it? Yes, but you need to move now. Qualls turned to his staff, voice sharp with renewed purpose. Drone coverage shifted to these coordinates. Get the extract team rerouted, and get Commander Grayson on encrypted comms if possible. Tell him Watcher 6 sends authenticate. Avoid the wadi. Take the Shepherd Trail northeast. Captain Nesmith was staring at the personnel files still displayed on Morrison's tablet. Watcher 6? Qualls glanced at Dolores, something like respect entering his expression for the first time. Her call sign, when she was operational. The radio operator keyed his mic, voice professional and clipped. Paladin Actual, Sentinel Command, emergency routing change, standby for authentication code. Static crackled through the speakers. Then a voice, tight with controlled tension. Sentinel Command, Paladin Actual. Send authentication. Authenticate Watcher 6. You are danger close to hostile ambush position. Alternate exfil route follows. A pause that stretched 5 seconds. Sentinel Command, Paladin Actual. Watcher 6 authentication verified, standing by for coordinates. Dolores closed her eyes briefly, and something that might have been pain crossed her face. That call sign had not been spoken aloud in 8 years. Hearing it come through the speakers made something crack open inside her chest, releasing memories she had worked very hard to keep contained. Lieutenant Sark was overlaying the goat trail route onto the tactical display, measuring distances and elevation changes. Trail exits here, approximately 2.8 kilometers from current hostile positions. If they move fast and quiet, they can reach it before the enemy adjusts. Dolores opened her eyes and focused on the screen. They need to move north, shoulder at the choke point. Ghulam will have pressure sensors on the main path. Stay tight to the rock face and they will avoid triggering them. How do you know he has pressure sensors? Because I would have placed them there, and Ghulam thinks like I do. The statement carried implications that no one had time to unpack. Major Qualls was already directing his staff, orders flowing in rapid succession. Coordinates were transmitted, drone coverage was repositioned. The extract team received updated landing zone information. The operations center had transformed from helpless paralysis into focused action. And at the center of it stood a woman in maintenance coveralls directing the operation with quiet authority. Captain Nesmith approached her slowly, the earlier irritation replaced by something more complicated. Senior Chief, I need to ask, why did you wait? Why not come forward immediately when you knew Paladin was in trouble? Dolores met his eyes without anger or judgment. Because for 8 years I have worked very hard to be someone who does not have to think about ambush tactics and enemy force disposition. Because I built a life where the worst thing that happens is someone complains about the floor being wet. Because choosing to come back into this world meant breaking something I will not be able to fix. The honesty of it created a small pocket of silence around them, even as the room buzzed with activity. Nesmith nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that had nothing to do with tactics or operations. Lieutenant Morrison looked up from his terminal, face tense. Hostile forces are reacting. They are starting to reposition. Dolores moved back to the main display, studying the updated drone feed. The red diamonds representing enemy fighters were shifting, some moving toward the goat trail route. Ghulam knows something. Changed. He is recalculating. How can you tell? Because this is what I would do. She pointed to a cluster of enemy units. He is hedging, keeping forces on the Wadi approach while sending a smaller element to cover the alternate route. He does not know exactly what we know, but he knows we know something. Major Qualls stood beside her, both of them studying the tactical picture with the intensity of chess players 3 moves from checkmate. Can Paladin reach the trail before those forces block it? If they move now and maintain pace, yes. Barely. Dolores traced the routes with her finger, calculating distances and movement speeds. But once Ghulam commits to the trail route, he will collapse his entire force toward it. The window is maybe 6 minutes. That is not enough time. It is if we give him a reason to think his original plan is still working. Qualls turned to look at her fully. What are you suggesting? Dolores kept her eyes on the screen, watching the red diamonds flow across the terrain like blood cells through a vein. Noise discipline breaks. Make Ghulam think the team is still moving west into the Wadi. 2-minute diversion, just enough to pull his attention while Paladin slips north. That could draw fire on the diversion team. 30 seconds of suppressive fire from Extract 2 on the western approach. Enough to sell the deception. Ghulam will not commit his people to a target he cannot confirm. He does not waste resources on unknowns. Major Qualls studied her, weighing the risk against the alternative. You are betting 8 lives on your assessment of one man's decision-making process. Dolores finally turned to face him, and the weight behind her eyes was heavy enough that Qualls actually took a half step back. I am betting on knowing Ghulam Mazdek better than he knows himself, because I spent 14 months learning exactly how he thinks when he believes he has the advantage, and right now, he thinks he does. The room had gone quiet again. Everyone, watching this exchange and understanding they were witnessing something rare. A decision point where institutional authority confronted lived experience, where doctrine met ground truth, where the question was not who had rank, but who had knowledge. Major Qualls held her gaze for exactly 5 seconds. Then he turned to his radio operator. Execute diversion. Extract. 2. 30-second suppressive fire on western approach coordinates. Make it loud. Copy. 30-second suppressive fire, western approach, to Lieutenant Sark. Coordinate with Paladin Actual. Time their movement to coincide with diversion. They need to be on that trail before Ghulam realizes it is a feint. Understood. Qualls looked back at Dolores. If you are wrong, 8 men die, and it is on both of us. Dolores nodded once, accepting the weight of that statement without flinching. If I am wrong, Major, I will have failed them the same way I failed myself. But I am not wrong. The radio crackled. Sentinel command, Extract 2, in position for diversion. Ready on your mark, stand by. Time compressed into a single point. The operations center felt suspended between one reality and another, balanced on the edge of a decision that could not be unmade. Dolores stood perfectly still, hands loose at her sides, breathing steady and controlled. She had done everything she could. The rest belonged to terrain and training, and the hope that she had read Ghulam correctly after all these years. Major Qualls keyed the radio. Execute. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the speakers erupted with the sound of automatic weapons fire, the distinctive crack of suppressive bursts echoing across the valley. The drone feed showed muzzle flashes on the western approach, bright stars against the darkness. Lieutenant Sark tracked the enemy response on his screen. Hostile forces reacting, majority element moving toward the diversion. Dolores watched the red diamonds flow west, pulled by the sound and fury of gunfire that suggested a target worth pursuing, but a smaller cluster remained near the goat trail, hesitating. Come on, Ghulam, make the call. Paladin Actual is moving. Lieutenant Morrison had a separate channel open, tracking the SEAL team's progress. On the trail now, double-time pace. The suppressive fire continued for exactly 30 seconds, then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow louder than the gunfire had been. On the drone feed, the hostile forces that had moved west were slowing, spreading out, searching for targets that were not there. Ghulam knows. Dolores kept her voice flat, stating fact without emotion. He is pulling them back. The red diamonds on the screen began reversing course, flowing back toward the center, but the movement was hesitant, uncertain. Ghulam was recalculating, trying to determine what he had missed and where his enemy had actually gone. How long until he figures it out? Dolores studied the pattern of movement, reading it like text. 3 minutes, maybe 4. He will check the wadi first because that is the most logical alternate route. When he finds it empty, he will expand his search pattern. And if he expands north, then it comes down to who reaches the extract point first. Lieutenant Morrison updated Paladin's progress. They are making good time. 2 kilometers from LZ. 10 minutes at current pace. Hostile element on the trail route is repositioning. Lieutenant Sark highlighted a cluster of red diamonds that had begun moving more purposefully. They are heading toward the extract point. Dolores felt her jaw tighten. He figured it out faster than I expected. Major Qualls keyed the radio. Paladin actual, hostile forces moving on your position. Estimate contact in 8 minutes. Can you increase pace? Negative, Sentinel command. Terrain is technical. Moving any faster risks injury. The math was simple and brutal. 8 minutes until contact. 10 minutes to extract point. Paladin would be 2 minutes short. And 2 minutes was an eternity in a gunfight. We need to slow them down. Captain Nesmith was already moving toward the tactical display. Air support. Even a single pass would force them to take cover. Qualls shook his head. We still do not have clearance for cross-border engagement. Then we get Paladin out 2 minutes faster. Dolores studied the terrain around the goat trail, looking for something she could use. There. She pointed to a narrow section where the trail passed beneath an overhang. If you put fire on this ridgeline, the noise will funnel through that canyon. Ghulam will have to slow down to assess the threat. Buys maybe 90 seconds. 90 seconds is not 2 minutes. No, but it closes the gap. Major Qualls made the decision without hesitation. Extract 2, new coordinates. Suppressive fire on ridgeline position. Do not hit the trail itself. We just need noise. Copy. Engaging ridgeline. The drone feed lit up with muzzle flashes again, this time concentrated on the rocky outcrop above the trail. The hostile forces moving north immediately slowed, spreading out and taking defensive positions. They could not see the SEAL team from their angle, but the gunfire suggested that the trail might be defended. It is working. Lieutenant Sark tracked both groups simultaneously. Hostile advance has stalled. Paladin is pulling ahead. Dolores allowed herself the smallest exhale of relief. Then she caught herself and pulled it back in. Nothing was over until everyone was off the ground and beyond the border. 6 minutes passed in a silence broken only by radio updates and the quiet hum of electronics. The operations center felt like a held breath. Everyone watching the drone feed as 2 groups of people moved through darkness toward a collision point that would determine whether 8 men lived or died. Paladin Actual has reached the LZ. Extract 2 is inbound. 60 seconds to pick up. Hostile forces have resumed advance. They are 3 minutes from LZ. The math had shifted in Paladin's favor, but only barely. 3 minutes was enough time to load 8 men onto a helicopter and clear the area, but it left 0 room for complications. A mechanical failure, a missed approach, anything unexpected would tip the balance back toward catastrophe. Dolores watched the screen and felt the old fear rising in her chest, the fear that came from knowing exactly what capture meant, exactly what those 8 men would face if the helicopter did not reach them in time. She pushed it down, forced her breathing to stay steady, and trusted that the people doing the extraction were as good at their jobs as she had once been at hers. Extract 2 has visual. Touching down now? Come on. Lieutenant Morrison was not talking to anyone in particular, just voicing what everyone was thinking. Come on. Paladin Actual is loading. 30 seconds. The hostile forces on the screen were close enough now that Dolores could see individual heat signatures breaking away from. The main group, scouts moving ahead to establish visual contact. They would see the helicopter any second. Paladin Actual is airborne. The relief in Morrison's voice was echoed across the room in a collective exhale that felt like the building itself was releasing tension. On the drone feed, the helicopter rose from the landing zone and banked hard north, gaining altitude rapidly. Below it, the hostile forces reached the LZ 45 seconds too late and could only watch as their targets disappeared into darkness. Paladin Actual is secure, all personnel accounted for. Major Qualls set down his radio handset with deliberate care, as though it might shatter if mishandled. Then he turned to face Dolores, and the expression on his face carried the weight of someone who had just witnessed something that would change how he understood his job. He brought his hand up slowly, a salute, formal and deliberate. One by one, every officer in the room followed. Lieutenant Sark, Captain Nesmith, Lieutenant Morrison. Even the radio operator stood and saluted. The gesture was precise and heavy with meaning, an acknowledgement of service and sacrifice that transcended rank and protocol. Dolores did not return it. She was no longer in uniform, no longer part of the structure that gave salutes their meaning. Instead, she nodded once, a small movement that accepted their recognition without claiming any right to it. Captain Nesmith approached, and the man who had earlier dismissed her as an inconvenience now looked like someone confronting the fact that he had been catastrophically wrong about something important. "Senior Chief, I need to apologize. I should have seen." Dolores cut him off gently. "It is just Dolores now, Captain, and no one was supposed to see. That was the point. Still, I am sorry." She studied him for a moment, then offered something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "You saw when it mattered. That is enough." Lieutenant Faraj had pulled up her service record, reading through it with the expression of someone discovering an entirely different person had been standing in front of him all along. "Commander Grayson asked us to pass along his thanks. He wants to meet you personally when he returns." Dolores shook her head. "Not necessary, Lieutenant. Tell him I am glad his people are safe." "That is enough," he insisted. "He will be here in 3 days. Then I will not be here in 3 days." The finality in her voice made it clear this was not a negotiation. Faraj nodded slowly, understanding that some debts could not be repaid, because the person who was owed them did not want payment. Major Qualls waited until the others had moved away before approaching. His expression had shifted from operational focus into something more personal, the look of someone trying to understand a decision that made no sense within his framework. "I put in a request to reactivate your clearance, get you into an advisory role. Someone with your knowledge and experience should not be cleaning floors." Dolores met his eyes without wavering. "I appreciate it, Major, but I left that life for a reason. You saved 8 men tonight. I answered a question. That is all." Qualls studied her, seeing past the deflection to the truth underneath. Why disappear? Someone with your skills, your record, you could have had any position you wanted. Training, intelligence analysis, consulting. Why this? Dolores looked past him to the tactical display still showing the valley where she had been held captive, where she had learned exactly how much a person could endure before they stopped being the person they used to be. Because I needed to become someone who did not have to use those skills anymore. Because I needed to prove to myself that I could exist without violence being the answer. Because every time I close my eyes, I still see that valley, and the only way I have found to live with that is to be someone who has nothing to do with it. The honesty of it created a pocket of stillness between them. Qualls nodded slowly, understanding entering his expression. And now, after tonight, now I have to figure out if I can still be that person, or if tonight broke something I will not be able to fix. If you ever change your mind, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. Dolores nodded. You will know where to find me too, Major. Same corridors, same night shift, same floors that need cleaning. She turned toward the door, and the room let her go. As she stepped into the corridor, the fluorescent lights and polished floors welcomed her back into their familiar rhythm, offering the comfort of anonymity after exposure, the safety of invisibility after being seen. If you have ever had to step back into a world you left behind in order to help someone else, share that experience in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to see how sometimes walking away from recognition is its own kind of strength. 6 hours had passed since Paladin Actual lifted off from the valley floor. 6 hours since Dolores had stepped back through the operations center door and returned to the world she had built from careful subtraction. The base felt different in the early morning light, as though the crisis had left behind a residue that changed how shadows fell across corridors and how voices carried through open doorways. Dolores pushed her maintenance cart along the same route she traveled every night, the wheel still squeaking its familiar rhythm. She had retrieved it from where the MP had made her leave it, checked the supply levels in her bottles and bins, and resumed the work that defined her public existence. Her coveralls were dusty now from the ventilation crawl space, and her knees carried the dull ache of too much time spent crouching, but her movements maintained their methodical precision. The difference was in how people looked at her. Or, more accurately, the difference was that people looked at her at all. A young airman emerged from the administrative building, spotted her approaching, and stopped. He straightened slightly, a reflexive gesture born from military training, and nodded with deliberate respect. "Morning, ma'am." Dolores returned the nod, but kept moving, maintaining the rhythm that had carried her through 6 months of invisible existence. The interaction lasted 3 seconds, but it represented a fundamental shift in how she occupied space within the base infrastructure. She was no longer background. She had become visible, and visibility carried weight. She passed the communications hub, where Lieutenant Farage stood in the doorway talking with 2 other officers. He saw her, paused mid-sentence, and tracked her progress down the corridor, with an expression that combined respect and something like uncertainty. When their eyes met, he nodded. She nodded back. Neither spoke. The acknowledgement passed between them like a handshake neither had expected to offer. The operations center was quieter now, running with a skeleton crew during the shift change between night operations and day administration. Through the partially open door, Dolores could see Major Qualls standing at the same tactical display where hours earlier he had coordinated a rescue operation, guided by intelligence from a maintenance worker. He was debriefing with his deputy, gesturing at the terrain map, likely documenting everything that had happened for the official record. Dolores did not stop. She moved past the door with her cart, eyes forward, maintaining the boundary between what had happened and what needed to happen next. Her shift did not end for another 2 hours, and floors did not clean themselves, regardless of who had saved whose life in the darkness before dawn. She reached the eastern corridor where she had begun her night, completing the circle that defined her routine. The water fountain she had wiped down at the start of her shift needed wiping again, accumulating dust and fingerprints with the steady persistence of entropy. She set down her spray bottle and cloth, and began the same circular motions that had started this entire sequence of events. The sound of boots on polished floor announced someone approaching. Dolores did not turn, keeping her attention on the water fountain while tracking the footsteps through sound alone. Military boots, standard issue, measured pace that suggested purpose rather than urgency. The steps stopped 3 feet behind her. Dolores. Major Qualls' voice carried the carefully neutral tone of someone navigating unfamiliar social territory. "Do you have a minute?" She finished wiping the fountain before turning. Her hands were damp from the spray bottle, and she dried them on her coveralls in a gesture so automatic it bypassed conscious thought. "Yes, Major." Qualls glanced down the corridor, confirming they were alone, then spoke in the quieter register, people used for conversations that were not quite official, Commander Grayson called. "Wanted me to pass along his thanks personally. Said to tell you that every member of Paladin Actual owes you their lives." Dolores absorbed this information without visible reaction. "I am glad they made it home safely." He also said something else. Qualls studied her face, looking for something he apparently did not find. He said Watcher 6 was one of the best tactical minds he ever worked with. Said, if you were back in operation, he would request you for his team without hesitation. That person does not exist anymore, Major. Grayson seems to think otherwise. Dolores picked up her spray bottle, needing something to do with her hands. What Commander Grayson thinks and what is true are not always the same thing. The person who earned that call sign disappeared in a valley 14 months after she was captured. The person who came back was someone different. Someone who needed to not be that person anymore. Qualls nodded slowly, and Dolores saw, understanding in his expression, that had nothing to do with tactics or operations. He had read her service record, had seen the medical evaluations and psychological assessments, had understood at least intellectually what 14 months of captivity did to a person. But understanding intellectually and understanding viscerally were separated by a gap that could only be crossed through lived experience. I pulled some strings, got you assigned to day shift maintenance, better hours, better conditions. It is not much, but it is something. Dolores shook her head. I appreciate the thought, Major, but I chose night shift for a reason. Fewer people, less interaction. That is what I need right now. And what about what those 8 men needed? What about what might be needed next time? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Dolores set down her spray bottle and met his eyes with the directness that came from having nothing left to prove. Next time, someone else will answer the question. Someone who has not already paid the price I paid for knowing the answers. I did what I could tonight because no one else could. But that does not mean I am available for next time or the time after that. It means I stepped into the light long enough to prevent something terrible. And now I am stepping back into the dark where I belong. Where you chose to belong. Yes, where I chose. That is the important part, Major. Choice. I lost that for 14 months. Now I have it back. And what I choose is to clean floors and go home and not think about ambush tactics or enemy force disposition, or what happens to captured operators in valleys where nobody is coming to save them. The honesty of it seemed to satisfy something in Qualls. He nodded once, accepting her boundary without trying to push past it. If you change your mind, if you ever need anything, the offer stands. I know. Thank you. Qualls turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Your personnel file has been reflagged, classified access only. As far as official records show, you are exactly who your name tag says you are. Dolores Embick. Maintenance contractor, nothing more. Dolores felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she had been carrying since the moment she stepped through the operations center door. Thank you, Major. That means more than you know. I think I have some idea. He walked away, boots clicking against the polished floor, in a rhythm that faded gradually until silence reclaimed the corridor. Dolores stood alone with her maintenance cart and the water fountain that still needed cleaning, and for the first time since breaking her 8-year silence, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she could return to the life she had built from careful invisibility. The rest of her shift passed in the familiar patterns that defined her existence. Floors were mopped, trash was collected, surfaces were wiped down. The base woke up around her as day shift personnel arrived and night shift personnel departed. The changing of the guard that happened every 12 hours with the reliability of a biological process. She moved through it all like water through a pipe, following the path of least resistance, occupying space without claiming it. When her shift ended at 07's hours, Dolores returned her cart to the maintenance depot, signed out on the clipboard that tracked contractor hours, and walked to the parking area where her truck sat in the same spot it occupied every morning. The sun was fully up now, harsh and bright after the artificial lighting of indoor corridors. She squinted against it, fumbling in her pocket for sunglasses that were scratched and years old. The drive back to her apartment took 20 minutes on roads that cut through landscape that gradually shifted from military installation to civilian sprawl. She lived in a small unit in a complex that housed mostly contractors and support staff, people who worked on or around the base, but did not belong to its formal structure. Her neighbors kept to themselves. She kept to herself. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. Inside her apartment, Dolores went through the motions of post-shift routine with the same mechanical precision she brought to cleaning floors. Boots off, coveralls into the laundry, shower long enough to wash away the physical residue of 8 hours, but not long enough to waste water. Toast and coffee that she ate standing at the kitchen counter while staring at nothing in particular. She should have been tired. Her body certainly was, muscles aching in the particular way that came from sustained physical labor. But her mind was racing, replaying the events of the past 12 hours in a loop that would not stop. The operations center. The tactical display. Ghulam's name spoken aloud for the first time in 8 years. The weight of every eye in that room landing on her simultaneously when her true identity emerged from classified files. She set down her coffee cup and gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles going white with pressure. Breathing became something she had to think about, rather than something that happened automatically. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Count to 4, count to 4. The technique had been taught to her by a therapist she no longer saw. Someone who had tried very hard to help her understand that what she had experienced was trauma, and that trauma required processing rather than burial. Dolores had stopped seeing the therapist after 6 sessions, not because the therapy did not work, but because it worked too well, bringing things to the surface that she needed to keep buried in order to function. She had chosen burial, chosen invisibility, chosen a life built from not being the person she used to be, and now that person had been dragged back into the light, whether she wanted it or not. She released the counter and walked to her bedroom, a space so Spartan it could have belonged to anyone. A bed, dresser, single chair, no photographs, no decorations, no evidence that a specific individual with a specific history occupied this space. She lay down on top of the covers without bothering to change into sleep clothes, staring at the ceiling while her mind continued its relentless replay. Sleep should have been impossible, but exhaustion won the battle against adrenaline. She slipped under without noticing the transition and dreamed of valleys and voices speaking Pashto and the weight of rope against her wrists. She woke 6 hours later to afternoon light slanting through the blinds and the realization that she had 3 hours before her next shift began. The routine resumed. Shower, food, coveralls. The drive back to base through traffic that had thickened with the evening commute. The security checkpoint where guards waved her through with the bored efficiency of people who had seen her pass this way 1,000 times before. The base felt different at dusk, caught. Between day operations and night operations, neither one thing nor another. Dolores signed in at the maintenance depot, collected her cart, and began her rounds. Same corridors, same rhythm, same work. But the looks had not stopped. If anything, they had intensified. Word had spread the way word always spread on military installations, through informal networks that move faster than official channels. The maintenance worker who saved the SEAL team. The woman who used to be someone important. The contractor with the classified past. People nodded. People made space for her in hallways. People said, "Good evening," with a weight that suggested they meant something more than simple greeting. Dolores received it all with the same neutral expression she brought to every interaction, acknowledging without encouraging, present without being available. She was wiping down the water fountain outside the operations center, completing the same task she had completed at the start of this entire sequence when Captain Nesmith appeared in the doorway. He stood there for several seconds, watching her work, before speaking. "Dolores." She looked up from the fountain. "Captain, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the acknowledgement that I was wrong about something fundamental. Not just wrong about you specifically, but wrong about what it means to see people clearly." Dolores straightened, cloth still in hand. "You saw what you expected to see. That is human nature, not a moral failure. Maybe. But human nature is not an excuse for treating people as though they do not matter. I needed to not matter, Captain. That was the point. You gave me exactly what I wanted, even if you did not know you were giving it to me." Nesmith absorbed this, his expression suggesting he was trying to reconcile multiple contradictory truths simultaneously. "Still, I should have seen, and I will do better." Dolores nodded, accepting this promise without demanding proof. "Thank you, Captain." He started to leave, then turn back. "One more thing. The whole base knows now. About what you did. About who you are. I know you value your privacy, but you should know that people are talking. People are grateful. Let them talk. Let them be grateful. As long as they let me clean floors in peace, I can live with whatever they say about me." Nesmith smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Fair enough." The rest of the shift passed without incident, if you did not count the steady stream of respectful nods and careful acknowledgments from people who 3 days ago would have walked past her without seeing her at all. Dolores received it all with the patience of someone who understood that attention was temporary and that eventually people would return to their own lives and concerns, leaving her to fade back into comfortable invisibility. She was wrong. 3 days after the Paladin rescue, Commander Grayson arrived at the base as promised. Dolores was mopping the floor in a secondary corridor when Lieutenant Farage found her, slightly out of breath from moving quickly. "Dolores, Commander Grayson is here. He wants to meet you. I told you to pass along that I was glad his people were safe. That is all the meeting required. He drove 8 hours to get here, specifically to see you. I do not think he is taking no for an answer." Dolores stopped mopping and looked at Farage with the expression of someone confronting an inconvenience they had hoped to avoid. "Where is he?" "Operations Center." "Of course he is." She left her cart in the corridor and walked to the operations center with Farage half a step behind, moving quickly to keep pace with her longer stride. When they reached the door, she paused, hand on the handle, gathering herself for an interaction she had specifically tried to prevent. Inside, Commander Grayson stood with Major Qualls examining something on the tactical display. He was shorter than Dolores expected, maybe 5'9", with the lean build of someone who spent their life in motion. His face carried the weathered look of years spent outdoors in harsh conditions, and his eyes moved with the constant assessment of someone trained to identify threats before they materialized. He turned when the door opened, and his eyes locked on Dolores with immediate recognition, despite never having met her face to face. "Senior Chief." "Just Dolores now, Commander." Grayson crossed the room in 4 quick steps and extended his hand. Dolores shook it, noting the calluses and scars that marked it as belonging to someone who worked with their hands in dangerous contexts. His grip was firm without being aggressive, respectful without being deferential. "My team and I owe you our lives. There is no adequate way to thank someone for that, but I wanted to try anyway. You do not owe me anything, Commander. I answered a question. Your training and your people did the rest." Grayson smiled slightly, the expression of someone who recognized deflection when they heard it. "Major Qualls briefed me on what happened, how you identified the trap, how you guided the tactical response, how you knew enemy disposition better than our intelligence assets. That was not just answering a question. That was operational brilliance from someone who should still be operational. Should is a complicated word, Commander. What should be and what is possible are not always aligned. I read your file. I know what you went through. I am not asking you to come back. I am just saying that what you did 3 nights ago saved 8 men who have families waiting for them. That matters. You matter." Dolores felt something shift in her chest, the same loosening she had felt when Major Qualls promised to reclassify her personnel file. She had spent 8 years building a life predicated on not mattering, on being invisible and unremarkable. Having that foundation challenged, even with good intentions, created instability she was not equipped to handle. I appreciate that, Commander, truly. But mattering is not the same as wanting to be seen. I did what I needed to do because no one else could. That does not change what I need going forward, which is to clean floors, to go home, to live a life where violence is not part of the equation, to be someone who does not have to carry operational knowledge in her head like a loaded weapon waiting to go off. Grayson studied her for a long moment, and Dolores saw understanding in his expression that went beyond intellectual agreement. He had been doing this work long enough to recognize the cost it extracted, had lost enough people to know that survival came in different forms and that sometimes walking away was its own kind of courage. I understand, and I respect it. But if you ever change your mind, if you ever need anything, my team and I are in your debt. That does not expire. Thank you, Commander. I hope I never need to collect." Grayson nodded, shook her hand again, and let her go. Dolores turned and walked out of the operations center, past Lieutenant Faraj, who was trying unsuccessfully to hide how moved he was by the exchange, and back to the corridor where her cart waited in patient silence. She resumed mopping. The floor did not care who she was or what she had done. It just needed to be clean, and she was the person responsible for making it that way. The simplicity of it was comforting in a way that gratitude and recognition could never be. The remainder of her shift passed in familiar rhythm, and when it ended she returned her cart and drove home through darkness that felt less heavy than it had 3 days ago. The dreams when she slept were still there, still sharp, but they no longer felt inevitable, just possible, just something she would continue to navigate one night at a time. 2 weeks later, the base settled back into routine. The Paladin rescue became one story among many, remarkable but not singular, part of the institutional memory that accumulated like sediment over years of operations. People still nodded to Dolores when they passed her in corridors, but the weight behind the gestures had lightened, becoming simple acknowledgement rather than profound recognition. She was exactly where she wanted to be, visible enough to be seen if needed, invisible enough to exist without constant attention, neither erased nor exposed, just present. One night near the end of her shift, Dolores paused at a window overlooking the base. Dawn was beginning to break over distant mountains, the same mountains that enclosed the valley where she had been held captive and where she had escaped and where 8 men had nearly been captured 3 weeks ago. The light touched the peaks first, turning them golden before descending into the valleys where darkness still pooled. She placed her hand against the window glass, feeling the cold surface through her palm. In the reflection, she saw both versions of herself layered over each other like a double exposure. The operator she had been, sharp and capable and eventually broken. The person she had become, quiet and steady, and deliberately unremarkable. They coexisted in that reflection without conflict, without one trying to erase the other. Radio chatter drifted from the operations center. Routine check-ins, weather updates, the sound of a base that continued functioning because people showed up and did their jobs and trusted that others would do the same. Dolores listened to it the way she might listen to ocean waves, finding comfort in the repetition and predictability. She removed her hand from the glass, leaving behind a faint print that would fade in seconds. Then she picked up her cart and continued her rounds, moving through the base with the same methodical precision she brought to every shift, every night, every choice to show up and do work that mattered precisely because no one noticed it happening. Somewhere in a valley across the border, Ghulam Mazdek had undoubtedly recalculated, had recognized that someone who knew his tactics was still alive and still capable of interfering with his operations. He would adapt, adjust, continue being the person he was, just as she would continue being the person she had chosen to become. The difference was that she had made her choice freely, had walked away from the life that had nearly destroyed her and built something else from the wreckage. That choice had cost her recognition and advancement and the community that came from shared service. But it had given her something more valuable, the ability to exist on her own terms. The freedom to be unseen until being seen was the only thing that would save someone else. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was actually more than enough. Maybe the difference between disaster and survival sometimes did come from the people who chose invisibility, not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to not need validation from a system that had failed to protect them when protection mattered most. Dolores finished her shift, signed out, and drove home as the sun rose higher. She would sleep, she would wake, she would return for the next shift and the one after that. The work would continue, the floors would need cleaning, and she would be there, present but not prominent, visible but not exposed, carrying knowledge she hoped never to use again, but keeping it ready just in case. Because sometimes the most important people are not the ones standing in the light giving orders. Sometimes they are the ones moving through shadows, making sure the foundations hold. Sometimes they are the ones everyone dismissed until the moment when dismissing them would cost everything. Sometimes they are the ones who clean floors at 02:47 in the morning, hearing everything, seeing everything, and choosing very carefully when to speak. If you have ever chosen to step back from something that defined you in order to find peace, or if you know someone who carries more than others can see, share that story in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that strength comes in many forms and that the people we overlook often hold the knowledge we need most, consider subscribing, because stories like Dolores's remind us that recognition is not always about being seen. Sometimes it is about having the freedom to choose when and how we show up in the world.